Now, there's a big problem with a blank slate, and that is blank slates don't do anything. They would just sit there forever receiving inscriptions unless they had something in their organization that actively recombined the inscriptions on the slate and used them in pursuit of certain goals. No one denies the importance of learning, socialization, and culture. Only a madman would say everything is in the genes and that our experience doesn't count. The question, though, is what are we born with that allows us to learn and that allows experience to leave its trace on future behavior? When Locke said there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses, I think the perfect reply came from Leibniz when he said, except for the intellect itself. And indeed, it's this recognition that has led to a number of threats to the blank slate from contemporary sciences that are studying the human mind. For example, my own field, cognitive science, has underscored that you need innate mechanisms to do the learning to begin with, and that these innate mechanisms are complex and multiple. Cognitive scientists have argued that babies are born with some concept of an object and of causation, that we have a number sense, a number of spatial representations that allow the brain to keep track of the environment and of objects in it, a theory of mind or intuitive psychology by which we infer the mental states of other people when we interact with them, and a language instinct that allows us to communicate our thoughts, and executive systems of the frontal lobes which receive information from many parts of the brain and that affect decisions that the rest of the brain and body carry out. Evolutionary psychology has challenged the blank slate by showing that beneath all of the cultural variation that anthropologists have trumpeted for the last 100 years, there's also a bedrock of universals, emotions and behavior patterns that are shared by all human beings across the world's 6,000 cultures. Recently, the anthropologist Donald Brown has cataloged them. He's found a good 300 universals, everything from aesthetics, affection, and ambivalence, all the way down to verbs, violence, vowels, weaning, weapons, and attempts to control the weather. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate in another way by showing that many human drives can't be seen as ways in which people calculate what's best for them in their own day-to-day lives, but rather can only be understood as adaptations to an ancestral environment in which we evolved, which may not be relevant to our happiness and well-being today. An obvious example is our taste for sugar, salt, and fat, which has obvious health consequences, as many of us eat ourselves into an early grave with too much junk food. But it's perfectly understandable why we have those tastes. Those are precious nutrients, and in an environment in which they were in short supply, a taste for them would have been adaptive. Now that we can crank out mass quantities of the stuff, our taste for them hasn't changed, and that does us more harm than good. A thirst for revenge and a willingness to defend your interests with violent defenses of one's honor lead to a great deal of unnecessary suffering, vendettas, blood feuds, cycles of revenge, and so on, but were necessary in a world in which you couldn't dial 911 to get Leviathan to show up to settle your scores for you. And a reputation for toughness was one's only defense against being a punching bag. And less obvious example is our desire for attractive mates. Now, a number of years ago, the humorist Fran Lebowitz made a very insightful observation about human psychology. She said, people who marry someone that they're attracted to are making a terrible mistake. You really should marry your best friend. You like your best friend more than you're likely to like anyone that you happen to be physically attracted to. You don't pick your best friend because they have a cute nose. But that's all you're doing when you're getting married. You're saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you because of your lower lip. Now, this is a puzzle, and I think the solution to it is demonstrations that many of the anatomical signs of beauty are in fact advertisements of health, fertility, and fitness. And in being attracted to people with that facial geometry, we're maximizing the chances that our genes will combine with the best other genes. Neuroscience has shown that there's a complex genetic patterning to the brain, although it's obvious that the brain has a great deal of plasticity, which is necessary for us to learn and remember. There's also a great deal of complex structure that's laid out in the course of development in utero. This is a diagram of the primate visual system. It's not an oil refinery. Comprised of some 50 distinct areas interconnected in precise ways. And it's not just the overall cabling of the brain that is partly under genetic control during development, but some of the fine structure that makes one brain different from another. Here's a diagram from a recent study by the neurobiologist Paul Thompson and his colleagues at UCLA, in which they measured, using MRI, the distribution of gray matter in different parts of the brain of a large sample of people. And they tested for correlations between amounts of brain matter in different parts of the cortex and plotted them in false color so that purple represents zero correlation, and colors that differ from purple, that are green and yellow and pink and so on, represent significant correlations. Now, if you pair people at random, by definition the correlations are zero, and here you see in a left view of the brain, right view of the brain, top view of the brain, what zero correlation looks like. This is what happens when a pair of people share half their genes, namely fraternal twins. You can see that large amounts of the brain show correlations from one twin to another. And this is what happens when you share all your genes. There are areas with very strong correlations, and large parts of the brain show some correlation, suggesting that the shared genes build brains that are more similar. And it's likely that these aren't just anatomical curlicues like your earlobes or your fingerprints, but have functional consequences. Nicely summed up in this cartoon, also from the New Yorker, by Chaz Adams. Separated at birth, the Malafert twins meet accidentally. Now, this is only somewhat of an exaggeration. Studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and then are tested in adulthood show that they often have astonishing similarities. My favorite example being the twins, one of whom was brought up as a Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany. The other was brought up as a Jew in a family in Trinidad. Nonetheless, when they met each other as adults, it turned out that both of them kept rubber bands around their wrist. Both of them dipped buttered toast in coffee. Both of them flushed the toilet both before using it and after using it. And both of them liked to sneeze in crowded elevators to watch everyone jump. Now, these admittedly are anecdotes, but they've never been documented in any pair of fraternal twins separated at birth and reunited in adulthood, and they're corroborated by the best measuring instruments known to psychology. That is, that there are enormous similarities among twins reared apart, which leads to what's sometimes called the first law of behavioral genetics, which is that all behavioral traits are partially heritable, although nowhere near completely. The noble savages also